and to an Arab zone. The plan was immediately rejected by Arab leaders as unacceptable. Zionist leaders accepted the plan, although their intention to share the land was questionable.
Shortly after the UN partition plan was proposed, the British government announced the British control over Palestine would end on May 15, 1948. Both Arab nationalists and Zionists prepared for inevitable war.
The Jews were extremely well prepared and well trained militarily, while the indigenous Palestinian population had to rely on troops sent by other Arab nations, Egypt and Syria in particular.
During the 1948 war, tens of thousands of Palestinians were driven from their houses by Jewish troops. Even those not directly threatened left their homes temporarily to seek safety for their families. They fled to the countryside, expecting to return home when a ceasefire was declared.
But once the conflict was over, the newly created state of Israel decreed that none of the people who left during the war could return. This created the problem of the Palestinian refugees, which lasts to this day. The Armistice of 1949 consolidated the borders and secured a contiguous land for Israel from the Lebanese border in the north to the southern tip of Eilat.
About 700,000 Palestinians lost their homes in 1948. That year is now celebrated by the Israelis as their year of independence. It is commemorated by the Palestinians as the Nakba, or catastrophe.
In creating their new home, Israel had dispossessed the Palestinians, thus creating a complex identity for the young Jewish state. Israel's early decisions would likely fuel hostility for a long time. Surrounded by hostile Arab nations, the young state of Israel felt vulnerable and organized itself around security concerns.
Due to violent European anti-Semitism and the systematic annihilation of 6 million European Jews, many Israelis felt they were justified to use all means possible to protect themselves. Security has become the cornerstone of every Israeli policy, a goal that often seems more important than peace itself.
Over the decades, Israel's military capacities grew to outnumber that of all its Arab neighbors combined. Its economy also developed at a very fast rate, making it the most developed and powerful country of the Middle East.
As Israel grew, the new Israeli government established new villages on what had previously been Palestinian land. Jewish newcomers from around the world came to inhabit those villages.
Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Arab states remained openly hostile to the State of Israel, which they saw as a colonialist project in the heart of the Arab Middle East. Three significant military campaigns, 1956, 1967, and 1973, of direct confrontation between Israel and a coalition of its Arab neighbors, all resulted in Israel's victory on the battlefield, but failed to bring any kind of peace.
Notable was the June 1967 war when Israel attacked all of its neighbors simultaneously. In barely 6 days, Israel defeated neighboring Egypt, Syria, and Jordan.
The 1967 war made it clear that Israel had become the greatest military power of the Middle East, superior in strategy, equipment, and training to all of its opponents combined. Israel took the Gaza Strip and the Sinai from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the West Bank of the Jordan River from Jordan. The war also resulted in the displacement of 280,000 to 325,000 more Palestinians, adding to the overall Palestinian refugee problem.
In the years following the war, the main question was what Israel would do with these occupied territories. Egypt traded land for peace, but Syria refused any peace treaty with Israel. With the occupied territories of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, populated by many Palestinians who are 1948 refugees and their descendants, the question still remains.
In the 1970s, the Israeli government again began a policy of encouraging Jewish settlements, this time in the Palestinian territories of Gaza and the West Bank. The encroachment on the land and water resources of the occupied territories by an increasing part of the Israeli population would make it more and more difficult for Palestinians to eventually recover control of those resources at a later time. As the Israeli economy became more and more dependent on Palestinian land and water, it also used more Palestinian manpower as part of its workforce. This made two economies more and more interdependent. So, if Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza can never be granted Israeli citizenship, what can Israel do with them? How can the otherwise democratic state of Israel deal with permanent occupation and inequality between citizens of Israel and the stateless Palestinians.
After the devastation of the Nakba, the Palestinians took time to regroup. There was, and still is, an enormous imbalance of power between the parties. Israel is a full member of the United Nations, with the most powerful army in the Middle East. The millions of Palestinian refugees, however, were scattered throughout many different Arab countries, often treated as second-class citizens.
A new generation of Palestinians, fueled by the rage of disempowerment and dispossession, began organizing in the late 1950s and early 1960s. They chose armed resistance against Israel. The Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, became the embodiment of the Palestinian struggle.
The resistance of the PLO was inspired by various revolutionary movements of the 50s and 60s, from Algeria to Vietnam. The Palestinians were supported financially and militarily by the Soviet Union, which used their struggle for geopolitical leverage in the Cold War with the United States. The PLO launched guerrilla attacks against Israeli